Welcome to Off the Wire, the podcast that helps you curb cybersecurity risk and tackle technology challenges. I'm Tanner and I'm joined by Anthony. We're two IT executives with a combined 35 years of experience in the IT and cybersecurity field. Let's start the show. All right, welcome back to episode 27. We titled this one Cloud Dreams versus On-Prem Realities. And I know we're all working toward trying to determine what's best for our companies, whether that's on-premise, a hybrid environment, or fully into the cloud. We've all dealt with the back and forth of deciding on which one is best, and Anthony and I are going to try to break down some of the myths that we've heard about cloud, and share our experiences and kind of where we're at and what we're looking to do in the future. So, Anthony, I hope you're having a good evening so far.
Yeah, it's going great. Recovering from watching the Jake Paul, Mike Tyson debacle last night, but doing pretty good.
Yeah, I did not watch it. Obviously, I heard all kinds of technical issues. So Netflix, you would think would have that kind of stuff ironed out, but I did follow along on a kind of like a live feed, um, and it seemed like it was one that I'm glad I didn't watch. So
Yeah, outside the technical issues, it was still worth missing.
yeah, so I don't know. I don't know if I'm for the exhibition things they're doing these days or not, but um, I guess it definitely pays the bills because they keep doing them. So, in this episode, as I mentioned earlier, we're talking about a cloud versus on-premise, and this is something that's everybody's been asking themselves. I think, I mean, honestly, I would say maybe for the past 5, 7 years. Um, it's gone back quite a bit now. I don't think one has cemented itself versus the other yet. But just kind of, thought we'd just start off talking about our own environments. So, how's your environment laid out, and right now, like, where does it land?
We're definitely a hybrid environment. I'd say in the past few years, we've definitely gained more cloud products, but it's a pretty big blend. And some of it's for strategic reasons we use the cloud or on-prem, and some of it's just a cost. But we're definitely a hybrid environment, got a wide mix of both.
Yeah, we're kind of the same. We got a I think we started earlier into some cloud options before a lot of other like small medium businesses. But we haven't, I would say, really dove into the cloud. I'd say somewhere probably in the 90-10, 85-15 kind of range. Still mostly on premise, and some of that we'll talk about as we go about why that's the case. But our environment, in a lot of ways, is still a pretty big legacy environment. One of the things we first did in the cloud, and I thought you might could chime in too with like kind of your first experience in the cloud was S3. So for those that may not be aware, S3 is a way to kind of structure storage, and it doesn't really have to be in the cloud. But we used it in Amazon AWS, and we were basically just storing kind of things that we needed the public to see. We needed a way to publicly store stuff so that we could link things, whether that's in surveys or on our website or in our email, and having like linked photos actually show up without them having to be stored somewhere local. So um, it was interesting. Obviously, I was part of that as we went in, and it definitely felt like I was learning a new language.
For us, Microsoft 365, I think most of us are on that. I know we rolled that out before quite a few organizations, and at least the ones that we knew of, we were kind of one of the early birds on that. The other thing is Snowflake for data analytics. So we utilize that just because some of the data analytics that we did with our servers, it would just run extremely slow, and we needed the power of infrastructure that could ebb and flow as needed.
Yeah, and I think when we talk about kind of the benefits, I think you're going to see a lot of that kind of thing, especially from a cloud perspective. Um, why do you feel? I was thinking about this as we were preparing for the show. Like, why is the debate not settled? Because it was kind of an on-premise world, right? And we were all living in it. From my career, when I got started about 16 years ago, and nobody even heard of the cloud. There might have been some like kind of VPN connectivity into someone else's data center to maybe like have some sort of resources, but especially not public clouds. Public clouds weren't really a thing, or they weren't as broad as they are now. Um, but at the same time, I guess when cloud started, I don't know if you thought the same, but I thought it was gonna kinda take over at first. I mean, the way it came
Yeah.
out, I was like, "Okay, well, in 10 years, we're all gonna be running on the cloud," and I guess maybe that's the younger me, being a little naive and not understanding, I guess, kind of the heartaches and the heartburn about migrating environments, but I was optimistic. I was like, "Okay, we're going to the cloud. Here we go. There's no point in any of this infrastructure anymore." So what in your opinion, like, why have we not, like, landed in one camp or the other at this point?
Yeah. Well, I just want to go back a few years, and I know the cloud's been around much longer than this, but when I arrived my organization 6 years ago, I recall two organizations, they had in their strategic planning for their infrastructure to move 100% to the cloud. And anyways, I thought that was a pretty bold move and a pretty bold statement from both these organizations. I was a little envious thinking about it because I knew that in our case that was never going to happen, and that's not because there isn't a want or a desire. Um, I mean, I think there's definitely pluses on both sides, but we've got some vendors. There's a lot of proprietary software that we use in our industry, and I just know some of our vendors like that's not going to happen. It's not going to happen anytime soon, and I knew that when I started 6 years ago. But as far as which one is the best, I don't think there is a best. It's really up to each organization, and is dependent on what kind of tool set it is. Um, we lean towards the cloud typically, and I feel we got a pretty good reason. It's just where we're on the coast and just constantly dealing with hurricanes. Now we've done a lot of redundancies and spent a lot of money to make sure if we get hit that we can still stay up and running, or at least keep and retain our data. But that really knowing that you could get a Cat 5 that could just knock you off the map, it really makes the cloud environment enticing.
Yeah, I can understand that, and kind of moved into our next question here, but talking about deciding where to place things and why. Like I said, we're still mainly an on-premise shop, and I think for us, maybe getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, hybrid is definitely the way we see things going forward. The reason we kinda put things in one place or the other, we try to come up with a process and just try to figure out what makes sense. I'm gonna kinda be on the other side of this, I think, and we were kinda talking in the pre-show. I think maybe me and you're gonna be on not complete disagreement, but I guess some different sides of it. I would say, and I'll talk about some of the problems we've had, but I would say I lean a little bit more on premise. I wouldn't say it's it's not hugely one way or the other. I would say maybe it's more like 60-40. I
Mhm.
still think I think there's some perfect use cases for the cloud and there's perfect use cases for on-prem, but I guess we've kinda seen some of the things, and I'm gonna talk about a little bit later. I've seen some disadvantages, on both sides of things, and so I think what that's given me is really like a healthy skepticism for both, if that makes sense. So I'm like,
Yeah.
you kinda have to prove it to me, either way. Like, you better prove it that the cloud, like, really helps, or you better prove that on-premise really helps, or otherwise I'm liable to decide one or the other. As we've kinda put things out there, just they've kinda fit into a role, and you talked about 365 and some of the others, um, and, if you've kinda felt the same way, I mean, if you felt like when you've gone through different software, they've just kinda made sense to fit in one place or the other?
Yeah, depending on each one, but I will say I definitely lean towards the cloud environment if it's available. I mean, unfortunately, I just know with some of our vendors, we'll never have most of our stuff in the cloud. And the unfortunate part is you'll hear it both ways. You'll hear that the cloud's cheaper or on-prem's cheaper. And honestly, until you put your full stack in the cloud, it's going to be more expensive in general. I know there's always exceptions, and we have some of those exceptions, but
That kinda leads us really into our next question we were talking about, so advantages and disadvantages, so, I'll list a few and you kinda chime in. For me, I think scaling, if you have a workload that's real scaling dependent. I have a really great example. There's a company nearby. They do retail and they have a huge rush toward the end of the year, obviously on Black Friday, really the whole month of November. And so they need a situation where they're actually scaling up maybe like 10 times or even more for that 1 month. And then the rest of the year, they can handle it with like one of the machines that they had. So in an environment like that, or maybe an environment where you need to do in a particular process and you need to like really ramp up the CPU, but then normally throughout the day you need that much. Those make a lot of sense to me. And honestly, you can make on premise do that. It's just very expensive because you got to have a lot of stuff sitting there. Um, Cloud facing applications. So I guess what I'm saying here is like public facing applications. So um, anything where, in our case, our members, but it could be customers, if they're actually directly hitting it, I tend to lean cloud if it's possible. It doesn't always possible, just because there's a lot less like security exceptions and exemptions that I have to make. Whenever someone from the public's hitting inside my network directly, it doesn't matter if that's a DMZ or whatever else. I tend to I tend to think twice, I guess, about that, versus other things.
Yeah, one of my golden rules is do not have WordPress on my network,
Yeah,
and, our website, it's built off some instance of it. It's definitely a hardened instance, but, anyway, before we got to that, we didn't have a company that really hardened WordPress and used it, and I know it got brought up whether we're gonna host it on-prem or push it to the cloud. I was like, "That's 100% going to the cloud. It's not going on our network."
yeah, and that's kinda exactly what I'm talking about is and then we do the same thing, our website, we have it hosted, just because it is kind of I guess, the window into our company, so, um, there's potential there. It's the most public and well-known thing that we own, and there really honestly doesn't need to be any integration to our environment, so, it's hard to make the argument that way. Any other, like, cloud, kind of advantages on the cloud side that I missed in that list?
Well, just to touch on scalability. So I mentioned earlier we use Snowflake for the data analytics. So when we're not using that application, we don't need all that CPU, all that processing power. So that's one. And the other one is as far as scalability, and we're using this very little, what I consider very little compared to like a huge organization. But for us, just our backups, those we've scaled way up. And honestly, I don't think we could buy the storage for what we're paying for that to be in the cloud, which is kinda surprising.
Yeah, no, and one thing I didn't mention, the ability to spin up quickly, not even just scale per se, but just, like, time to implement. Especially with SaaS, and we use several SaaS tools. Honestly, SaaS might be a whole nother category in itself, but, with those things, it seems like you can get stuff up and running really quickly. So that's a huge advantage to me, and we've done that with a few things. It's just so much easier to get going.
Some other things I would say with the cloud, some benefits is, 1, just the patching, and I never really thought about this a whole lot, but I went to a conference, it was a software company, and they were moving their full stack to the cloud, and I had questions for them. I was like, "This is seems kinda crazy. This was unusual for their market." And I said, "How are you guys gonna handle it right now? You've got a cloud and an on-prem instance, and they're completely different. What about development?" And they took a smart approach, like, they had their development, like, their in-house development, they were doing the on-prem, but they were basically outsourcing all the stuff, migrating it to the cloud. And the reason they were outsourcing it was because once they finish moving, they're not gonna need all those resources. But one thing they mentioned, they're like, "It's well worth it. We're gonna spend this time and there's all these things we're not going to have to do. Like we're never going to have to patch a system again, all these servers and stuff like that." And then they mentioned they were like, "We just relocated our server farm," and it took the entire organization, all hands on deck, to get that done, and it was a huge impact. They were down for like a week. A lot of systems were, and they're like, "We're never going to have to move a server farm again once we get all of our stuff in the cloud." And they were using AWS. I don't know if it was private or public, but they were moving their full stack there. And those are some pretty big benefits to not have to worry about updating servers, firmware, OS. That takes a lot of people and a lot of resources. And that's going to allow them to focus on software development, which is kind of their bread and butter. The other benefit is kind of what I alluded to earlier is the disaster recovery and resilience. Um, we had a on-prem phone system, and it's I'm not going to name the name, but it's one of the bigger players in the market, and it was pretty reliable. But I would say like maybe every 2 years we would have an issue, and their support was atrocious. Like it probably could have been fixed within an hour, but just dealing with the support that we dealt with, like at one time it dragged out for like I think it was like 10 hours, and for an electric co-op, not taking phone calls, that's unacceptable. I mean, it just is. And the last instance they had, I said, "We're done. We're moving." And I was very reluctant to look at cloud systems. I was just the whole thought of the delay. You know, you got a phone on your desk, it reaching out to the cloud and making those connections. I was like, that just seems like it'd be slow or something like that. And anyways, we tried several systems, and honestly, I got to thinking about my old company. They used Skype for their phone calls, and if your internet was bad, like you'd have issues. But if you had great internet, you really didn't have issues. And at our organization, we have awesome internet, so that wasn't an issue. But we moved to a cloud-based phone system, and part of it was I talked to them about the amount of downtime that they've had, and this company has been around quite a while, and they haven't had any downtime. And I talked with several of their clients. They couldn't name one instance when their phones went down that was on the vendor side. But moving our phone system to the cloud has been one of the greatest moves we've had. And the other thing, like if we lose internet, like we can still forward our phones over to a third party call center.
Mm.
So we're getting some disaster recovery with that. So we've got this third party call center, and whether our internet is up or working, we can still forward those calls. If we had some core systems that were in the cloud, we'd be able to completely operate even if the company was down. But unfortunately, we don't have that. But anyways, so that's some other benefits with the cloud environment.
Yeah, I can understand that. We also I think a phone is one of those that's really useful as well. Now, we actually do a hybrid approach where we have our kind of our member forward-facing, numbers that our outside folks are gonna be calling in. That's in the cloud. All of our internal phones are still, self-hosted, and probably don't see a lot of need to change that. I mean, and there's some pros and cons of that, as well. Um So for us, it's just the fact that should we have internet issues like that, we have an extra layer of communication. So we can pick up a handset and talk to someone, versus being completely isolated.
Yeah, and for that, we rely on our radios and cell devices, which I know you just recently dealt with cell devices not being available.
Yeah, and so yeah, I was gonna plug that at the end, but for those that may not be aware, we did a Hurricane Helene, after kind of an after action report. Needless to say, communication networks were either non-existent or terrible. So, um, yeah, I think I've changed my perspective on a few of these as well. So, on premise, to me, I mean, we're just talking advantages at this point. I think on premise advantages, performance is to me the number one thing. I think low cost could be there as well, but performance to me is, and I have dealt with this and seen this firsthand. We have tried, especially high performance applications. So I would think things like a huge database, type of high IO databases. We found mapping to not be the best in the cloud. And I would say mapping, let me be a little more specific, mapping with the amount of actual points we have on our map. For an electric utility, we have tens of thousands, I think actually maybe hundreds of thousands of poles. You got meters, you got a lot of other things. So we got probably a quarter million points. And we have found that when we have seen that in the cloud, the performance was just not there. As you zoom in, it's really laggy, but having that in a local environment, it's super smooth with that amount of points. So, um, ease of integration is another one to me. So, because we have a pretty significant on-premise deployment, we're integrating together a lot. It's nice to be able to integrate without having to go across the internet. You're always going to be secure, even in your own network, but you have a little more protection. And kind of back to that performance, those integrations typically perform a little bit better and a little more real time. And then I mentioned costs, and that's the same for us. I have yet to find anyone that sells me a cloud product that doesn't cost more. Um, Now you can say that, hey, we're gaining on updates, like you mentioned. We're gaining on not having to set up hardware. We're gaining on that, but I have seen it. We've been doing some sort of cloud for the last 3 to 5 years, and I still have not seen it pencil out. Now, there's a lot of other advantages we just talked about of some of them, but I've never seen it pencil out to be cheaper. And it's just someone's got to run the hardware. So you either are you're paying yourself to do it, or you're paying someone else to do it, and they tend to make more money.
Yeah, the cost, I mean, I think in general, on-prem is definitely cheaper. Like I said, until you can move that full stack, if you've gotta have those servers, you've gotta have those fiber channel or iSCSI switches, you've gotta have that flash storage. Unless you could get rid of all of that, like, on-prem is for the most part gonna be cheap. And one thing you just kinda tied into cost is, and we've all seen this, and this is something where me getting back into the industry 6 years ago, this was a complete change. But back before, when I was an IT manager, like, you would buy a product and you would own it. Well, with these cloud tools and software, you don't ever own them. You pay a monthly subscription. And that's even moved over to the on-prem stuff. We've got some on-prem devices where we don't own it. I mean, it may be in our rack and on our system, and not like they're gonna take it back, but they're gonna de-support it and basically make it useless. So, anyways, that just really just costs are going up with everything, especially with that model.
We ran into a issue this week actually. So I don't know if you know this or not, but Microsoft Windows licensing, we had prior purchased a data center. Typically, is what we purchased just so we can have unlimited VMs. Or in certain cases, even way back, we would purchase like just the standard and go from there. But there is no more standard perpetual license, at least as far as our vendor is aware. They've moved standard licensing, so the core based licensing to an OpEx model versus a CapEx. So um, if you're basically leasing into that point, you can still get data center as a perpetual license, but obviously the costs are pretty high on data center, so it's not something you're going to do all the time. And to me, like on the cost front, um, the one I always use is like the example to kind of say like the cost has is definitely not cheaper is Microsoft Office. So Microsoft Office is something that we've had, obviously, as long as I've been there. We typically would purchase it as a perpetual license, and we would upgrade it probably every other version. So we wouldn't go every version, usually every other, and it was somewhere around that 5 to 6 year mark where the upgrade would happen. And so at that time, at least in that era, it was about I think it was usually about it was kind of around $100,000 somewhere around in there to upgrade the company. Whereas now at this point, it's very close to that, not quite that, but I would say 2/3 of the cost of that every year. So we were able to skip a version, and they were still supporting it, but there's just not a ton of improvements. At least at that time there wasn't. So we're able to kind of um, hop over a version, and we save significantly amount. I would say it's probably 50% more. That was probably a pretty good guess. 50% more now.
Yeah.
Of course, they do throw some stuff in there, so it makes it a little hard to compare apples to apples. But that's the one I always use, and it's just kind of stuck on my mind.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. We did a few things or we had a few scenarios that made it make a little more sense financially, at least for the first 3, 4 years, is where if we didn't change what we were doing, we were gonna have to upgrade our storage, and we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars to replace it, with a larger size, and moving everything to OneDrive and SharePoint. And on top of that, like, we only had like I think it was 1.75 gig inboxes, and now we got the 50 gig inboxes. It's awesome. We got a bunch of people that's got 15 gig inboxes, but that helped it make financial sense a little bit longer. But at this point, we've been in this 5 years now. Like, yeah, it's definitely more money. But like you mentioned, it's not apples to apples. They've got some add-ons that are enticing. But anyways, Microsoft has a stranglehold on us, just like VMware does. And Microsoft might even be worse. And anyways, I heard in 2025 they're going to raise a lot of things across the board. Don't quote me on that. That was just something I read. And anyways, I mean, what are we going to do? Tell them no, or we're going to switch? That's not going to happen at this point.
Yeah, and I think that the Microsoft one, the value proposition is narrowed somewhat because initially it was pretty much email exchange and your Office licenses for Excel, PowerPoint, and stuff like that. Now they do throw in a lot of stuff that we're using. We're using Teams, we're using OneDrive, we're using, some other of their tools. There's some security tools, spam filtering tools, some of those things that, like, are available now. So it was a worse value proposition, I think, earlier than it is now. Now that there's so many more other options inside the Microsoft family, I think Windows licensing, potentially other things.
So Tanner, I've got a question that's been lingering in my mind. Is there a scenario in which you either went on-prem or in the cloud, and after rolling that out, you kind of regretted that and wish it was the other way around?
Yeah, and I would say it didn't really change our goal, how we actually ended up doing it in the end. But when we first went to our cloud phone, or at least our cloud, like we call it IVR, kind of the automated attendant that you get at most companies when you call in, they actually had no way to do any type of secure tunnel or anything to be able to actually access some of our on-premise systems. This is a cloud system. And so we actually had to create another cloud server to basically act as a go-between on that. And that was one of those times when I was like, man, we're having to actually add extra infrastructure now to make this work. Whereas before we wouldn't have had to add anything. And I kind of wish now that got kind of solved as we went along there. But that was one of them. On from the cloud side, on the um, on-premise side, or actually, let me just go back there. There's another cloud one I wanted to mention too. Was when we had the storm, right? Because we lost almost all of our internet connections really quickly. I was second guessing every cloud decision I'd ever made because I'm sitting there thinking, we lose internet access here. I mean, we're going to be up for obviously a lot of our systems, especially our core systems, but we're not going to have communication with each other, email, Teams. Um, But, there was a lot of other applications, our phones, people aren't gonna be able to call us, or if they do call us, like, they're just gonna be able to get generic information. They can't report an outage, or they can't pay their bill, or any of those other things. So I was second guessing that. Now, obviously, it didn't end up going that way. We ended up keeping our last out of, 3 internet connections for the entire storm, but I definitely second guessed it, and I'm not gonna do anything differently. I still feel like we did the right thing. The odds of that happening are pretty low, but in the moment, I was sweating a bit.
One thing I can think of for the cloud, and it wasn't something that I rolled out; it was something that I inherited. And it's maybe it's not a great example, but we had basically it was a web proxy. So basically, anytime someone would go to say Tyco.com or whatever random website, it would go to that cloud proxy and then come back. And maybe it was just a bad product. Maybe it had nothing to do with being on the cloud, but there was just a whole lot of delay and lag and everything that they looked up or searched. It was, and we had a good internet connection. And what was funny is what I found was the IT department didn't use that proxy, and so they never experienced it because I people were complaining to me constantly when I started there, and I was like, "I can get to the site, it works just fine, everything." And then, like, I got the digging, and I'm like, "Wait, none of us have this tool that we forced on everyone else?" I was like, "We can't do that." And I was like, "Either we roll it out to ourselves and hash it out, or we just get rid of it." And anyways, we end up just going away with it, and we used it. It did some of our web filtering, but our firewalls did that, and maybe not quite as robust, but it was close enough. We did that. Anyways, that made a lot of people very happy. It made their just their whole experience a whole lot better. As far as on-prem was really just that phone system. This is before we had all of our network redesigned, and anytime we did maintenance and everything like that, we took the phones down. What killed us is we had this third party call center, but because our phones forwarded to them, it took it down. And that was one of those things where it took us a while to get there. And we had that one incident to really help solidify that decision. But moving the phone to the clouds, we can do maintenance on our network, and it has no impact as far as at least our customers being able to reach someone. So that would be an example on that.
Okay. Um, Something I thought about, like I said, I'm pretty much a proponent of hybrid. Um, I would probably lean a little bit on premise, but not a lot. Like I said, 60/40. I make plenty of let's go to the clouds decisions. For us, we kinda have a process, and then do you guys have a process like, "Okay, I'm getting into XYZ product, um, is this something that I'm gonna be putting in the cloud, or is this something I'm gonna be putting on premise?" Do you start with the premise that it's gonna be in the cloud, and you have to prove to me that it should be on premise, or how does that work for you guys?
I don't know that we have like a formal process, but usually when we're just talking new products, we'll talk through it, and that's always a conversation that does come up. I'm just thinking of some of the security tools we had, and even like our when we moved to a ticketing system, do we want to have it in the cloud or on premise? And in theory, like in conception, we would have an idea based off of the product. But when we get to dig in the weeds, sometimes we would change our tune on that. So really not a formal process, but it is part of our discussions anytime we get a new product.
Yeah, same here. We don't have anything, like, written down, but, we'll just start discussing things and, kinda trying to figure out how integrations look. Integration is a pretty big deal, because especially if you have a hybrid environment, if you have something that doesn't integrate with anything else, it makes the decision a lot easier one way or the other. But once you have
Yeah.
integrations, obviously, you have to take that into account. So, no formal process, just, deciding application by application. Um, one of the things I thought we'd talk about is, like, any surprises we have had from the cloud. I have one, or actually I have 2, I guess. I talked a little bit about one earlier. We didn't move our mapping, but we had a mapping product in the cloud. I honestly I'd use Google Maps. I was like, "Okay, no big deal, we drag this thing around," but once we actually overlaid all of the items we had, the performance was really, much more inferior, to our on-premise solution. So that was kinda surprising to me, I wasn't expecting that, like I said, I'd used other online mapping products and didn't think anything about it. The other one was as an AWS, and I think really with any of these providers, especially the public providers, you gotta be really careful on cost, but, when we initially were doing backups to the cloud, we were using AWS, and the costs were outrageous, especially the, transit cost, so cost, uploading or downloading, not the so much the storage cost at the location, but, it got to be excessive. We did find another provider that was a little bit better that didn't charge for transit costs, but that was something that really surprised us, like, the monthly bill was just, like it was steadily climbing, and it was significant. We're talking, um, I would say it was getting close to several thousand, maybe even close to $10,000, a month, for a little bit there. So we, obviously had to change something that's, for our size company, that's just something that we couldn't do.
I remember looking at AWS pricing and trying to figure it out without, especially your initial venture into that. It is very hard to estimate. I mean, they give you all the information, but knowing how the traffic works and how much data they're pushing, that's just something that you typically won't monitor and know off the top of your head. So it can be very daunting to try to estimate what those costs are going to be. I guess one of the surprises I have is just with security with the cloud environment, and it's really just disappointment. If you look at Microsoft, you look at Salesforce, you look at, and I'm not trying to single these out, but almost all of them are the same. All of these cloud products, they sell security as add-ons. And why wouldn't you just make your system inherently secure? Why wouldn't you have that as the de facto? And it's just another way for them to leverage to get more money out of you. But that's really just been a surprise of all these systems that if you want the full security stack, you've got to pay extra for that. You've got to pay that premium. That's something I really just never anticipated, especially with everything going on in cyber. You would think that they would just have that as part of the base build. So that's been a real big surprise with every system we've looked at.
Yeah, I would kinda agree with that, and I don't think it's the cloud's fault, but I would also say that, especially as someone coming in, at least initially, like I said, 5 to 7 years ago, we started looking around at public cloud. Before I had any experience in it, I mean, you can make the wrong permissions on maybe like an S3, folder structure pretty fast to the point where, like, the whole internet has your data. And some of that, like I said, is just inexperience, but also some of that is the stakes are a lot higher because you are on the internet. versus like if you make that mistake internally, yeah, you still could get compromised, but they're gonna have to kind of make the outside wall first. Um, so I found that to be a little bit surprising as well. It's like how easy it is to get like way out over the skis on security, and I think that kind of leads us into the next topic here is security. Kind of want to get your thoughts on which is more secure, the cloud or on premise.
I do think it's a variable answer. I'm going to be the politician, not really answer your question. But if you're an organization, you got one IT person, and maybe you don't have any formal cybersecurity training, I would probably lean towards the cloud. I think you'd be better there. I think, and I'm not saying we're tip of the spear by no means, but we've got some folks that know about cybersecurity, and I feel like for us, probably on-prem is a little more secure. Depends on what it is, um, but in general, I would kind of lean that way. And the other thing is with all these cloud tools, if you're using AWS, like how trained are your folks? Even Azure, how trained are your folks? Even Microsoft 365. When Microsoft 365 first rolled out, I heard of several organizations getting hacked. And it was just like it wasn't Microsoft's fault. It was because they didn't roll it out with the proper secure. I mean, for the most part, it was they didn't have two factor on it, which Microsoft clearly says you should roll out with two factor. They always have either that or like the admins, their user account would also be their global admin account. So when they got that password, they had full global admin rights, could do whatever they want, or just weak passwords. So if you're the cloud, that's another thing, it's a negative on the cloud. I mean, this is with any solution, but like you said, it's more substantial in the cloud, but if your people aren't trained and don't know what they're doing when rolling out a AWS environment or something like that, you're already public on the internet, you've got a lot more risk.
Yeah, I'm gonna really take the politician answer and say it depends. No, to me, I always heard this, and I actually read a book pretty recently talking about this as a secure system is a secure system. It doesn't matter where it lives. It could be on premise, could be in the cloud. It either is designed and set up and configured securely, or it isn't. Kind of to your point, I think there's some inexperience on the cloud side. So in that regard, I think you maybe can get caught a little bit. Whereas in when you have an on-premise environment, you kind of know when you're working on the edge to be extra careful. And I'm a big believer in zero trust. So I believe that like it doesn't matter if it's in the edge of your network or internal to your network, you should be securing it just like it's on the internet. But you get a little more leeway on the on-premise side. Now, the flip side of that, I would say, is um, basically if you get hit in the cloud, especially if you're using SaaS services, Microsoft 365, and they take down your Microsoft 365 environment. At least it's not all of your environment. It's very unlikely for them to hit like Microsoft 365 and your other Oracle cloud and your other Salesforce cloud at the same time. Versus on the on-premise side, if especially if you have some bad configuration practices inside your network, and they get inside, it could be literally every application on the on-premise side together. Maybe they hit your VMware instance, or maybe they hit your backups, or something like that. So the risk can be a little higher for an individual application on the cloud, and I think a lot of that's just experience as we kind of grow in our skill sets, especially at a small medium company, right? On the flip side, I think the blast radius could be potentially higher on-premise.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of where I land on it.
Yeah, I've never really thought about that, but you're definitely right with the on premise. A lot of times it's they get the whole stack because they get in your VMware infrastructure or whatever your virtualization system is.
As I was mentioning, that misconfiguration, that could be a pretty big downside to cloud. And misconfiguration can go a lot farther than just like actually putting in like a wrong setting and putting yourself public from a security perspective. But it could be just not thinking of like the normal things you do on our network to an on-premise environment. Like when we set up a VM, right? One of the last things we do is set it up in our backup environment. So I know you were talking a little bit in the pre-show and telling me about a time where you had because it was a cloud application, you had some things kinda go awry on you.
Yeah, and I've seen this debate numerous times about people backing up their Microsoft 365 environment. And the Microsoft stance is we don't back up your data; you're responsible for it. And I've heard some people saying, "Well, Microsoft isn't going to lose your data," and I can somewhat agree with that, but you might lose your data. and we had a misconfiguration. Now, it was a pretty big instance of basically of our SharePoint data that we had, and deleted it, and it was purged. Like the archive data was gone, everything was gone. A lot of times, the archive data could save your hind end and find it in a recycle bin, but that was all completely blown away. We don't have a very expensive method. We got a pretty cheap method of backing up our Microsoft 365 environment. And fortunately, we implemented that. So we were able to recover that data from a backup. That's happened. We've had that happen twice. Once was just one file that got completely purged, but a lot of people are like, well, I'm not going to back it up. They're not going to get hacked or whatever. You may screw up your data and lose it. Like I would put that as probably the most likely thing to happen. And I think my folks are great at doing that, but we've made mistakes. I mean, I've made mistakes in AD. And I remember almost blowing away some of our data in AD, not in Azure, but it can happen. So um, all of your cloud instances, you need to think about the importance of it. And are you willing to lose that data? And if not, you need to look at a method of backing it up. And we've been making a lot of leadways into Salesforce. And I'm not really worried about Salesforce losing the data, but what if we do something and purge some of that data? So you definitely want to you want to look at the security, but you also want to look at the backups of all these systems. You can't just turn a blind eye and hope it's going to work out.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and honestly, I think that's one of the disadvantages of cloud is when you have an on-premise environment, it's typically very easy to kind of, like, put the next application into the same process tree, that you do with everything else. Whereas with 365 with Salesforce, some of those things, like you said, is it a backup of, like, they've lost your data? I don't think that's really likely to happen, but, what if you do something, someone deletes a folder, someone deletes a setting, and you have to go through a whole process of, like, how can we get to this data? And, like, in some cases with Microsoft 365, it's additional licensing, from your backup vendor typically. It doesn't fall under the same tree, and every cloud is a little bit different. Is it a SaaS service? Is it a public cloud? So there's some complexity. I would say is maybe one disadvantage of the cloud is it can add a lot of complexity, especially if you're in a lot of different if you're, kind of, in different public clouds, things like that, with different formats and different ways to do things in each one. So I was thinking about this, I wanna kinda put you on the spot a little bit. So let's say you walked into a new company right now, they have nothing. It's a startup, you're building from the ground up. Um, would you go fully cloud? Would you start with on-premise? Would you go hybrid? It's a blank canvas.
That depends on a lot of scenarios. There's a lot of situations where I would go back and forth on that. If if you're able to get access to the people that are very familiar with cloud systems, if you've got the expertise on staff, I would lean towards doing it in the cloud if I was building it from scratch. And that's assuming that you can get all of your vendors. If you can't get every single one of your vendors as a cloud instance, you might as well just scratch that. And that's the scenario we're in right now. But I would base that off of, what really just what's the budget, what's the expected budget, as far as hiring people and stuff like that. Because if you have everything in the cloud, but you don't have all that upfront cost of infrastructure. I mean, you'll have some. Obviously, you got to have switches, you got to have connectivity. But if you didn't have to buy that NVMe storage, if you didn't have to buy those servers, if you didn't have to buy VMware and all that, I would lean towards doing that, assuming I could get the people. And one thing is a challenge. Just we're in rural North Carolina, and I've been in a rural environment my whole life. Like it's hard to get qualified people in those environments. I mean, we get great people, but to find someone that is an expert in AWS or Azure, or whatever systems you're using, like sometimes that's hard. And a lot of times what we're doing is OJT, on the job training, getting our people up to speed, and they're great at that. But starting off, you can't do OJT if you're building a system from scratch. You got to be the expert in it. So I would like to lean towards building in the cloud, but I think there's a lot of gotchas that would push me in the other direction.
Yeah, I would the only thing I would really add, and honestly, I agree with all your points, is I would probably take a look at the business itself and what kind of model we are. Are we a retail shop where, oh, it's gonna be a big e-commerce presence? That's gonna change who we kinda mentioned some of these things like scaling and some of those other things. Then, that's gonna change my mind on a few things. Are we a local plumbing place where we have one IT person? That's gonna change my mind. That might push me to the cloud. Or are we gonna be a medium-sized business? Are we gonna even be an enterprise business where the skill set's not gonna be a problem, and we're gonna have specific workloads that we're doing that, is gonna maybe need ultimate performance. I think it's the business and what it's gonna do, should
Yeah.
factor in there as well, but otherwise, 100% agree with that, and it's really how we should approach all the problems, whether we have an existing environment or a new environment, is asking ourselves those questions.
Yeah, that's a good point. Looking at the business case or what the business is first, that definitely should be the first thing you're looking at. If you're in some kind of manufacturing and you got an OT environment, you're not going to have any choice but really have an on-prem system. So, like if that was the case, if we were dealing with PLCs and stuff like that, I would definitely lean towards on-prem primarily.
Yeah, if you had warehousing and you had, some sort of ICS, building system, you got machinery, those kinds of things. That would yeah, obviously, that's gonna change a lot too. So kinda looking toward the future as we wrap it up here, looking at 2025 for you guys personally, um, obviously, every company has new projects, new applications they're trying to deploy. What does your 2025 mix look like from a cloud/on-premise slash on-premise perspective?
One thing that we've looked at is, and this is just in regards to PCI, so we deal with credit card transactions and we're always looking to minimize our scope with PCI. So that's something where we might push a few services over to the cloud just to kind of reduce that scope. Um, but really, the systems that we're looking at that I'm thinking of at the top of my head, really, for the most part, they are all cloud-based systems. We're looking at some new cybersecurity tools, and honestly, we're testing waters right now, and they're all cloud. I mean, it really wouldn't matter whether they were on or in the cloud a whole lot to me. I would base those decisions solely off cost. What's going to be the cheapest solution, unless we lose some functionality, which has been the case. We've had some where on the cloud it was the same price, but we lost functionality, and so we went on prem just to gain that functionality back. So that's about what we have going on for 2025, a light year if we ever had one.
Yeah, is there ever a light year? I don't know, but, looking at us, for us, it's a mix. Like I said, I'm pretty strong on, hybrid. I think it's honestly the way to go. You basically pick applications and get the benefit of each depending on what you need. Um, but one I wanted to mention specifically is starting to look at some AI use cases, and for those, we're actually looking at some cloud options. But one thing we're finding with the AI options in the cloud is the cost can get extravagant very fast. Because of the way AI is working and how you're like actually running a model, you can get some pretty high costs. So we're going to do a little bit of both. We're looking at multiple use cases. So for certain use cases, we'll be using cloud AI products, and then we're actually looking at potentially having a in-house server to run some AI models, which I'm not gonna lie, that's also pretty costly in a lot of ways, especially when you look at the video RAM required for some of these larger models, larger LLMs. For us, that's the big thing on our plate. There's a lot of other small, things as well. We're kinda splitting things up and just picking it and as we learn, a lot of this is proof of concept, so we may go back and forth and waver a little bit there, but that's where it's heading for us. Anthony, any final advice you give to someone? They're sitting there, they've got maybe a mix, they walk into a new environment, maybe they're all on premise, maybe they're all in the cloud. When they're thinking about these kinds of decisions to make, any advice you give them?
I really wouldn't push anyone to lean either way. With the exception of if you're, and I say this even with AI, like if you're clearly just all on prem, you need to test the waters with some of the cloud and just be knowledgeable of it. I'm not saying to do a whole lot, but you definitely want to dip your toes into it and just learn about it. That's the same thing goes with AI. Like you just burying your head in the sand. Can't do that. You really just need to learn about the topic, and you never know when you're going to be forced to put some system in the cloud or just dealing with a new product. So I always say be venturous and try to learn these products and be knowledgeable of them.
I think that's a great point. in a world of technology that we're in and that all of our listeners are in, you can't ever just sit on your laurels. You have to be looking at the next thing, whether that's cloud, that's AI, that's whatever else technology that's coming out or will be out in the next 5 years. You got to learn about it. You got to figure that out. So I would agree with your points. I always heard kind of a mentor kind of had this saying that you should crawl, walk, run. I'm sure they got that from someone else. I'm sure they didn't make it up on their own, but that's my advice is no matter what you decide to do, is to start with like proof of concept, move proof of concept to like pilot, and move pilot to full. Um, and I think that'll help you along the way. That'll kind of keep you from those gotchas we were talking about earlier. Sometimes when you dive like fully into something, it's easy to make a mistake or to forget about something. But as you kind of work your way into it, not putting your head in the sand, but constantly kind of like navigating towards something, but in a controlled manner, I think you're gonna catch those things that you needed to catch as you went. Obviously, with cost, let's keep an eye on cost. One thing that, and we should have probably talked about it in the earlier segment about the advantages and disadvantages, but the advantage of cloud being a situation where you can spin up stuff quickly. That's also a disadvantage is when it comes to cost because it's really easy just to spin something up and then to come back on the backside of that and to be hit with maybe an unexpected cost. So again, going back to what I was saying, if you start with proof of concepts first that are smaller, you're probably going to avoid a lot of that. But there's the other thing.
I got a interesting tidbit to tie into that.
Uh,
We're testing out a seam, and it's cloud based. And anyways, they charge on CPU storage, just the in and out traffic. But we couldn't get our firewall talking, and we basically just turned on all traffic to go to the seam. And fortunately, it really wasn't that crazy. But just like in a couple of days, like it was like $300 or $400. So if we would have just left it for a month, like it definitely would have racked up. But anyways, we turned it down. We didn't need all the traffic. We were just trying to get something so we could see that it was communicating. But you definitely gotta keep your eye on that.
yeah, absolutely. Any final thoughts, Anthony, on the cloud versus on premise and the debate out there?
Yeah, well, I'm sure we'll be debating this for years to come. Really, just for each organization, they got to do what's right for them. But anyways, I'm still Team Go Cloud. But anyways, I'm not going to push anyone else to that.
Yeah, I don't know. You might have moved me a little bit. I think I'm gonna be like team 50-50. So just figure out what makes sense and go that route. And don't get yourself in a situation where you are forcing yourself into one way or the other. So I guess I'm still team hybrid cloud. But anyway, another great episode. I enjoyed this one. I think this is something that I thought, like I said earlier, the debate was gonna fall off, and we were just gonna have something settled, but it's still going along. Just thank you to our listeners. For those listening, we appreciate it, and of course, we do this for you, and that's why we do things. We want to provide some insights and be helpful. If you like what you're hearing, please be sure to subscribe on our different platforms. And of course, if you have any feedback for us, episode ideas, please reach out to us. You can hit us up at a show at offthewirepodcast.com or any of our social media. Um, and as we mentioned, we release every other Monday. And again, this has been an episode of Off the Wire. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.